So next up, before we break for coffee, we have our second thought leadership spotlight of the day, which is entitled Building Resilient, Inclusive Organizations. So in this presentation, we'll explore what it means to establish a sustainable culture of inclusion at your organization. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Chuck Adams. Chuck is the managing partner at Language and Culture Worldwide, which provides training, consulting, and translation solutions. So Chuck, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I have the nap time session, so that's nice. That's nice. Fewer witnesses in case this goes badly. Hold on, let me get the deck up here. So I am here, there I am. Funny story, I almost walked out of the house today with that suit on, which would have been unfortunate because you would have thought I only owned one suit, even though it is my favorite suit. So I was glad that I realized that it was going to be on the screen, and I just kind of backed out and went back into the house and changed. So welcome, my name is Chuck Adams. I am managing principal at LCW. At LCW, we've spent about 22 years helping our clients prepare for having the mindset, skills, and systems ready to compete in a culturally diverse world. And so I hope that you will learn something today. We are going to share some of our collective wisdom on how we have helped guide our clients past transactional efforts into more transformational outcomes. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I have about 20-ish minutes. I have some cards here, so I'm going to hew to these, not because I am afraid of not memorizing this, but it will keep me on track because I could speak for 20 minutes on my favorite blue suit. So this presentation actually came to be as we started to consider how it was that we have successfully guided our clients past some of the things that simply weren't working for them. Many companies hope to be, plan to be, certainly desire to be best in class and an employee of record in this competitive talent market. But what we have found is that many companies simply fail at this. They fail because they get to systems and mindsets and they don't think about the synergy between the two. And what happens is that the outcomes they're looking for are inconsistent and irregular. And so what we want to talk about today is how do we make those a little bit more regular? And I have a couple of case studies that I'm going to use of actual clients. So hopefully, if you have engaged in this kind of process, you will be able to recognize some of the efforts here. And if you haven't, you'll be able to use this as an opportunity to kind of map your own development with regards to this process. And so, in order to build a sustainably inclusive organization, we feel like you really need to support on developing mindsets, especially when it comes to your leaders and managers, as well your individual contributors. Then there's a necessity to really work on developing the maturity of your systems approaches. All of those things that go into the tools, systems, processes, policies that support your talent agenda. And so that's where we think that you can have the most success. What you're seeing now is our sustainable culture of inclusion model. You can see on the axes what we're talking about here. We have on the x-axis the systems approach, which are those tools, policies, processes, and technologies that support your talent agenda. We also have on the y-axis all of the mindsets that we're trying to make sure that we have used valid and reliable instruments as well as any engagement data that might be sitting around to determine where your organization is, and in particular, the leaders and managers within your organization. And so today, what I'm going to do, Well, I got really loud there. Today, what I'm going to do is we're not going to peel apart this model today. That's not what this session is about. But I thought you would need some grounding as I talk about the 2 client case studies that we're going to discuss, because we're going to use this as kind of an organizing principle in order to give you some insight into their development and their path. And so the goal for many organizations, we feel, is that top right corner, where you are running and truly optimized people systems, and you have what we call proficient mindsets in terms of the mindsets of the organization. That top right corner is called resilient. We chose that word very specifically because we think it means exactly what organizations are trying to get to, right? That your organization, because of the cross-cultural competence, because of the skills that you have developed in terms of its inclusion practices, as well as the systemic optimizations that take place, what happens is the inclusion efforts are baked into the DNA, right? Your organization is resilient because even a change of leader or a change in processes will not impact the organization's inclusive behavior, right? It's that deeply baked into the DNA. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about resilience, to be able to weather the storms of change and disruption. And so, again, we're not going to go through every detail of the model, but what I do want to do is just kind of give you very quick highlights of what those definitions are around the axes. And so what you should see is the systems, which are, and I'm going to just walk through them kind of left to right. Unstructured is when just there's not a lot of thinking that's gone on into the people systems that support your talent agenda. We see this occasionally with regards to companies that have had explosive growth or through M&A. They've grown through the M&A, and they are focused solely on delivering for the client or maximizing profits, and they really just haven't put a lot of time into thinking about and strategizing around their people systems. Defined is where thinking has gone into it. There are islands of excellence in terms of actually implementing it, but it's just not consistent. People will report the inconsistencies of it. They see that as unfairness or inequality, and that's where you get into some issues as well. And then implemented is where your strategies are well known by everyone. They are implemented and they are applied consistently. And then where we talk about optimize is really all about making sure that those systems have been pressure tested and that they are considered kind of living processes that are updated and incrementally improved as more information comes on, as the context of your organization changes and the such. And then if we look at mindsets, going from bottom to top, we have emerging mindsets where what happens, people in this mindset typically miss cultural difference, and when they don't, they tend to judge it negatively, right? When we see developing, that's where people see cultural difference. They see it, but they see it as potentially an obstacle to be managed and not an asset for excellence. And then, of course, when you get to proficient, that's where people see and they appreciate and they leverage cultural difference to increase innovation and creativity. And so that's the model. I just wanted to give you that grounding, and now we're going to go and get into some client case studies. All right? I have this thing in front of me, and I'm not using it. All right, so there we go. All right, we're going to start with Boston Scientific, who's given us permission to use this case study in this specific instance. It's really important to us to have long-term relationships with people who are truly interested in transformational change. The VP of HR and Global Chief Diversity Officer, Camille Chang Gilmore, has been a partner of ours since 2015. She has invested in us. We have invested in her and her team, and we have been able to pull off some pretty amazing results, which I'll talk about today. The transformation that we're going to discuss took years of really dedicated and very intentional work. And that's one of the things that I talk to people about all the time. You can certainly have a class. You can have 2 or 3 classes. But unless you're truly invested in really doing programmatic change on a transformational level, you're just not going to see the kind of resilient efforts that you're looking for. They may come, and you may see pockets of excellence, islands of greatness, but what's going to happen is you're going to see inconsistency across the organization. And so we began working with Boston Scientific at the end of 2015. We created a comprehensive strategy around and roadmap around where they wanted to go based on where they were. We began to deliver tools and training focused on unconscious bias, and we did so globally. What we also did is then brought in the Intercultural Development Inventory, or the IDI, which is an assessment that helps us gauge an individual's capacity for managing change, managing differences. And we use that with leaders around the world to help them get anchored in where they were on their own journey, which is very critical to then having them help others move on their journey as well. So in this first part, it was all about mindsets. It is all about focusing on mindsets and priming the mindsets for the later efforts that would come. And so in 2017, we then went into the Cross-Cultural Learning Partner Program. The Cross-Cultural Learning Partner Program, or the CCLP, is one where we take culturally different individuals within the organization that sit at different levels, that sit in different organizations or functions, and we put them together for 6 months of fairly rigorous assignments. These are scenarios, they are test cases, they are case studies, but then they are together learning and developing with one another and really interrogating why they see the world differently. It is a very intensive program, and again, one that lasts 6 months, and we saw significant increases in the interest as well as the increase in terms of their IDI scores of the leaders who were involved in this. And we did this with their HR leaders as well as their diversity, equity, and inclusion team as well. And then the real turning point came in 2017 when we were able to participate in their engagement survey. The results that came back really were telling in terms of what people's perceptions were of opportunities within the organizations. As you might imagine, women came back significantly scoring less on terms of their perception of opportunities available in the organization, as did black women and black men. So clearly there was a gap between what the leaders of the organization believed was an equality of opportunity and what the people were living in terms of their lived experience within the organization. And so that was interesting because it was necessary for the HR leaders as well as leadership to really embrace that as the cultural truth of their organization, and they did. The case study I'll share after this, they did not. And so there's a cautionary tale there. But these folks were primed because of the work on the mindsets to go ahead and accept that, take it as a challenge to be addressed, and to begin to do even more work in terms of the organization. And so in 2018, then we partnered with Boston Scientific to launch a comprehensive talent audit of their systems. Now, we had worked earlier in 2015, 16, and 17 on really focusing on the mindsets of the organization. Now we're starting to address the systems part, where we did a very comprehensive talent audit of all of their systems. We continued to train individuals across the organization at the same time. And at the end of 2018, bolstered by our recommendations, in terms of the survey analysis, in terms of the training that was taking place, we were able to build out metrics for what we thought were pretty good metrics for improving the talent systems that were in place. And so out of that work, Boston Scientific established what they called their 10, 20, 40 goals. They wanted to be a top 10 inclusive work environment. They wanted to make sure that 20% of all of their manager and supervisor roles globally were held by multicultural individuals. And they wanted to make sure that 40% of all of their manager and supervisor roles were held by women. Those are pretty lofty goals and pretty bold statements to say. because what it means is that somebody's not going to get those roles because we've identified who we are going to prioritize. By setting these objectives, of course, Boston Scientific began on a journey to reimagine their entire talent systems process. Everything was up for grabs. And so we began to really interrogate every system, whether it was part of their talent acquisition process, part of their talent development process, somewhere in their process for promotions or talent review. We were involved very, very actively in all of those elements as we began to interrogate the systems and ensure that bias was eliminated or mitigated as best we can. It's important to do these kinds of things in terms of the mindsets and then moving to the systems, because you can have very strong sense of system activity, but unless you have the mindsets there to recognize bias when it plays out, you can get into a lot of issues. I'm reminded of a study where a Northwestern professor who was also a researcher was asked by a consulting company to come in and take a look at their processes, their hiring processes. They had put together what they thought was a non-biased process with all these objective tests. And what she found was that in sitting there and reviewing them, the people who were on the cusp in terms of those assessments, those objective assessments, when they were white, they kept them in the keep pile. When they were black or brown, they put them in the reject pile. The thought behind that was the white guy was just having a bad day, right? So even when you have systems in place, people, well-intentioned as they are, without cultural competence, can consciously or unconsciously get around those systems and disrupt the work that you've done. And so that's why it's necessary to do both. And we see people who do a lot of one, but forget the other. And that's where I think the inconsistencies and the irregularities in terms of just their results continue to pop up. And so making sure that you're focusing on both are truly necessary. So between 2018 and 2020, a lot of activity was taking place at Boston Scientific. We had expanded training. We had started a boot camp for building a culture of inclusion. We had started a managing bias in talent acquisition boot camp, making sure that all of the recruiters were actively involved in that and could understand their own biases as well as biases that they might recognize within the systems. We began to push out more reinforcements via e-learning, begin to build out more training and particularly guides, toolkits in a variety of languages globally, and all of those things began to move the needle for where they were. And so you can see here where we started. They were kind of at this cusp between inconsistent and exclusionary. Certainly they had defined systems, but their mindsets just quite frankly weren't where they wanted to be. The next couple of years after that, we ended up in that functional but poorly leveraged kind of space where the organization was doing well, making money, but certainly had issues with regards to the feeling and perception of equality within its employee population. And then now we find them at that robust edge of resilient. And I have no doubt that they'll be moving into that resilient stage. The difference is that just needs to be time tested, right? Pressure tested, making sure that the things that they put in place stay in place, get stronger, and incrementally improve as more information becomes available. And so all of these things have been certainly recognized. This month, the folks over at Boston Scientific were given the Catalyst Award, which was a recognition of their consistent contribution to gender representation across the board. They have also increased their goals, not from the 10, 20, 40, to make sure that they still remain in the top 10 in terms of employers, but also that they want now to have 23% multicultural representation across management and supervisors, and 43% of representation of women in supervisory and manager roles. So they didn't even fall back on their laurels. They got an award for it. They were able to move the needle with regards to mindsets and systems in their organization. And what they did is reset the goals a little bit higher. And so they continue to push forward. So that's Boston Scientific. The next one won't take that long. So we engaged a international personal care company in about 2020, and it was an interesting experience. They had had a few incidents that had occurred, and so they called us in. What we found was an organization that was growing very, very strongly. They had positioned themselves in kind of urban care in terms of the personal care market, and had been hiring a lot of young people and people of color. That, along with the people who had been there, kind of their legacy folks who had been there for years, there just seemed to be a real disconnect in terms of how people felt they were being treated, with the legacy folks feeling as if they were treated just like everybody else, and the new folks, the younger folks, the people of color, feeling as if the legacy folks were getting all the benefits, that they were favored children. And so that was the disruption they had. We came in and were able to do surveys to get the quantitative data in terms of how people felt about the organization. Then we did focus groups to get qualitative data as we dug into that. And then we did interviews with leadership. When we reported back to leadership the disconnect between the policies in place and the lived experience of these new folks, let's just say the CEO was a little disappointed. So much so that he continued to spin on the fact that, but we have these policies in place. I know, but that's not the lived experience that people are having. But I don't understand. We have these policies in place that they say don't exist. I understand, but the lived experience of these people just don't simply represent that. It was an interesting engagement because they quite simply did not have the mindset. They weren't primed to accept the reality, the cultural reality of their own workplace. The work stopped pretty quickly there. The company was, quite frankly, a little bit of a mess. They ended up going through a massive restructuring. Leadership was cut, and the organization was folded into another part of the business, in part because of the issues they were having from a cultural standpoint. A lot of disruption and a lot of tension with regards to the employees, and inefficiency and ineffectiveness with regards to the work that was supposed to be done. And so that was a cautionary tale of what happens when the mindsets aren't primed to hear some of the messages that come back about the culture of the organizations. And so in our testing, we found that they were in this exclusionary phase. The arrow represents where we wanted to take them, but we never got a chance. And so I do want to leave you not with the cautionary tale, but with the success story, right? Boston Scientific's journey around certainly our culture of inclusion model took years of hard work. Again, this work is not for the timid. It is disruptive by its nature, right? It is challenging by its nature. And there has to be an investment of time, money, and resources in order to do it well. Anyone can do it, but in order to do it well, takes time, resources, and money. The work on organization mindsets was crucial to priming leaders because a lot of the data that came back in the engagement survey was challenging, but the leaders were ready to accept it, both in HR and the business leaders. They were really ready to accept this cultural truth and to address it accordingly. And then the work meant that the 2017 survey showed issues with culture. They were ready to address those things. And at the same time, without looking at the systems, they wouldn't be able to move towards resilience at all. And again, it's a prime example of what can be achieved when you are dealing with mindsets and systems in terms of partnership. And so, I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts, which are that no matter who you're working with, whether it's just internal or whether you're working with a vendor, just continue to keep in mind that as you begin to develop mindsets across your leaders and your supervisors and your managers and your organization, also begin to think about the work that needs to be done on your systems. And if you've done it in reverse, where you've worked on your systems and got them wonderfully debiased, know that there are people out there who are going to interrupt the efforts that you have because you haven't worked on their mindsets. They won't even see the inequality or the bias that they may be placing into the system. So, thank you for your attention. You have been very, very kind, and by kind I mean you have not booed me or thrown anything. And so I appreciate it. I do hope it was helpful to you. I know that a lot of people are involved in this or are thinking about it, but they just don't know where to start, or they just don't have a map of what it's going to look like. I hope that this was helpful in developing at least a mindset where you can think about what this might look like at your organization. Thank you very much, and I appreciate it. Stop by our table and say hi.